At 0612, on a summer morning in eastern Afghanistan, a Soviet motorized rifle patrol threaded its way through a narrow, rocky valley. Dust hung in the air. Sunlight struck the slopes at a sharp angle. From a distance, the soldiers seemed difficult to distinguish from the terrain around them. That was the assumption. More than 800 meters away, hidden observers watched through the rocks and immediately noticed movement. Not color, not pattern, movement. Minutes later, the valley erupted with gunfire, and the patrol found itself reacting instead of anticipating. The camouflage had performed well during exercises and training grounds. Afghanistan was not a training ground. Here, terrain rewrote the rules. The real mystery was not whether concealment failed, but why it failed so quickly. A lesson soldiers would relearn again and again. To answer that, we must understand the battlefield. Afghanistan challenged every assumption Soviet planners brought with them. When Soviet forces entered the country in December 1979, they encountered a battlefield, unlike the forests and plains that had shaped much of their military thinking. Vast deserts stretched across the south. Mountain ranges climbed beyond 3,000 meters. Rocky ridges overlooked narrow valleys, and vegetation was often too sparse to provide meaningful concealment. Under intense sunlight, shadows became sharp, and movement became easier to detect. Camouflage is designed with specific environments in mind. A pattern that blends effectively in one landscape can become surprisingly visible in another. In Afghanistan, clear air often allowed observation over distances exceeding a kilometer. Dust-coated uniforms and equipment, altering colors and reducing their intended effect. Seasonal changes brought snow in higher elevations and dry, sun-bleached terrain elsewhere, constantly shifting the visual environment. The uniforms themselves reveal the first clue. Some soldiers wore camouflage, most wore practicality. Throughout the Soviet-Afghan War, the majority of Soviet troops relied on standard khaki field uniforms, designed for durability, ease of production, and logistical simplicity. These uniforms were not created specifically for Afghanistan's unique terrain. They reflected a doctrine built around equipping large formations quickly and consistently across vast military forces. Specialized units received more advanced options. Reconnaissance teams and Spetsnaz operators often used KLMK camouflage suits, recognizable for their green base, color, and disruptive pattern intended to break up the human outline. Airborne troops and elite formations occasionally had access to additional camouflage, garments, and field-modified equipment. Yet these systems remained limited compared to the needs of the entire force. Soviet planners valued standardization because it simplified training, supply chains, and replacement procedures. On paper, the approach made sense. Every soldier received familiar equipment. Every unit followed established doctrine. But Afghanistan was not a battlefield that rewarded uniform solutions. Then the mountains began exposing weaknesses. The enemy often spotted movement before patterns. In the rocky valleys and elevated terrain of eastern Afghanistan, Soviet patrols quickly discovered that concealment was not determined by uniform design alone. It was dictated by movement, light, and elevation. A soldier stepping against a ridgeline silhouette became visible instantly, regardless of whether he wore khaki field gear or patterned camouflage. Against the sky, even subtle motion broke concealment. Dust became another silent disruptor. As patrols advanced along dry tracks, fine particles settled into fabric, shifting uniform colors toward lighter, uneven tones that often contrasted sharply with surrounding rock. Over time, this meant a camouflage. Pattern could lose its intended visual balance. Within a single mission, bright sunlight amplified every weakness. Hard shadows carved soldiers into distinct shapes, while reflective gear or exposed skin created brief flashes of contrast. In clear weather, observers positioned on higher ground could track movement at distances exceeding 1 kilometer. Yet camouflage was only one side of the equation. They didn't always need military camouflage. Mujahideen fighters often relied on what the environment already provided, rather than issued uniforms. Earth-toned clothing, worn fabrics in browns, grays, and faded greens, naturally blended into the rocky terrain of Afghanistan. Instead of standing out against the landscape, they became part of it through simplicity rather than design. More important than clothing was behavior. Fighters used static concealment, remaining still for long periods in shaded rock formations, shallow depressions, or behind natural ridgelines. Movement was minimized and carefully timed, often coordinated with terrain features that broke visual lines of sight. In many cases, a poorly chosen movement mattered more than any pattern on fabric. Local knowledge gave them an advantage that no standardized uniform could replicate. They understood how light shifted across valleys throughout the day, where shadows formed during peak sunlight, and which paths remained hidden from elevated observation points. This awareness turned terrain itself into a form of camouflage. But Soviet units were learning too. The solution wasn't a new uniform. Reconnaissance units and Spetsnaz teams quickly learned that camouflage effectiveness depended on far more than fabric patterns. They began modifying equipment with local materials, stripping reflective surfaces, and breaking up outlines with improvised additions. Movement discipline became critical, with soldiers adjusting spacing, timing, and use of terrain shadows to reduce detection risk. In many cases, positioning mattered as much as concealment, turning ridge lines, folds in ground, and shadow lines into defensive tools. Effective camouflage became a combination of pattern, movement, shadow usage, and positioning across unpredictable terrain. It was a new way of thinking. What emerged was a shift from uniform-based concealment to adaptive fieldcraft, where every decision in movement and placement affected survivability. Soldiers who understood terrain gained an advantage even without advanced gear, while those relying only on issued patterns remained, exposed in shifting light and elevation, conditions across valleys, theater-wide realities. The most effective camouflage was often invisible in reports. Part 5. Adapted reconnaissance tactics in Afghanistan significantly improved Soviet survivability by reducing exposure during patrols and increasing time spent undetected in observation roles. Observation posts placed along ridgelines allowed units to monitor movement across valleys with greater control over engagement timing. Ambush positioning shifted toward elevation advantage, points where terrain naturally compressed enemy movement into predictable paths. Standardized. Soviet approaches often relied on uniform patterns and doctrinal movement, which proved less effective in broken terrain. Field expedient solutions, including terrain-based concealment and adaptive spacing, consistently reduced detection probability at longer ranges. Sight. Reported observation ranges in clear conditions exceeded 1 kilometer, but adapted camouflage and positioning reduced effective detection windows. Significantly, CT, success rates in reconnaissance. Missions increased when units combined concealment discipline with environmental awareness and terrain exploitation techniques. The most effective gains came not from equipment upgrades alone, but from improved tactical judgment under real battlefield pressure. Yet the war's lessons would outlive the conflict. They influenced later doctrine across Soviet and post-Soviet reconnaissance thinking, where adaptability became as important as standard-issue equipment. Commanders increasingly emphasized field observation training, terrain reading skills, and concealment awareness rather than relying solely on issued camouflage patterns. This shift marked a broader understanding that survivability depended on behavior and environment interaction, not just visual disguise alone. In Afghanistan, camouflage became less about what soldiers wore and more about how they moved, where they stood, and when they chose to be seen in combat zones. The mountains became instructors. Afghanistan left a lasting imprint on Soviet and later, post-Soviet military thinking, forcing a reassessment of how camouflage was designed, issued, and used in combat environments. Over time, doctrine shifted toward the understanding that concealment could not be universal. It had to match terrain, climate, and operational behavior. What worked in one region could fail completely in another, even under similar combat conditions. Adaptation repeatedly proved more effective than rigid standardization. Units that learned to read terrain, adjust movement, and exploit natural cover consistently achieved better concealment than those relying only on issued patterns. This experience reinforced a broader lesson across military institutions. Equipment alone does not guarantee survivability. Skill amplified camouflage. Standardization provided equipment, experience provided survival. These reflections became embedded in later training philosophies, where field awareness and environmental adaptation were treated as core competencies rather than secondary skills. One final question remains. Would you trust the pattern or the person wearing it? The central lesson is simple. Camouflage is only effective when it matches both terrain and tactics. Without environmental awareness and disciplined movement, even the best designed pattern loses its value in real combat conditions. This story leaves a final question for you. Do you think concealment depends more on advanced equipment or on the skill of the person using it? Share your thoughts below.